Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Tulsa World Opinion Podcast. We are reviving it with Barry Friedman. I'm Ginnie Graham. This is Barry Friedman, the godfather of Tulsa comedy.
Thank
And
you for that.
and
Yes.
uh and Barry, we're doing this because Barry contacted me last night, a little riled up, a little wound up, would you say?
Yeah, a little bit. A little bit. Now, again, this is difficult because full disclosure here, right? Um, Karen Keith is a friend of mine. So let me just start by that. I've been to a fundraiser of hers. We've had lunch together. So let me just start there. What reason I wrote you is there are some mailers going out, and this is not just towards her, that now call her a MAGA Republican. And as you know, that, and perhaps you can better describe this than I can, who's running her campaign. It is run by, go ahead.
Well, I think it's run, from what I understand, it's run by a person who has worked with previous candidates in other races who
Right.
put some really conservative people in office. But I want to back up before we jump in because you're wound up, but I got to give some background. You were wound up about specifically the Tulsa's mayor's race. And
Right.
for people who out there, I would imagine our listeners know who's running and are tapped in. But for those of you who aren't, there are 7 candidates. 5, I would say, are legitimate. 3 are sort of in the top, but the 5 that we've been profiling, including, are Casey Bradford, John Jolly, Karen Keith, Monroe Nichols, and Britt Van Norman. So of the 5, 3 have sort of come to the top: Karen Keith, Monroe Nichols, Britt Van Norman. And of course, I think there are, of those 3, only 2 are qualified: Monroe Nichols and Karen Keith. So, but in the election is tomorrow, and in the last few days, we're seeing a lot of dirty tricks, negative campaigns, a lot of like that social media junk that happens. And this is what got you. So,
Some
yeah.
of it's coming from the left. It's coming from the far left that wants to separate, obviously, Karen Keith from Monroe Nichols, and they're Nichols supporters. And I understand wanting to be a Nichols supporter, but this is a Republican city. We've had Republican mayors the last 16 years, the last 20, or the last 24. So the
For
city
the last
really,
12 years, because you had Dewey Bartlett and then um
Bynum, 8 years,
Bynum, and that's, does Bynum have
16.
8 years, 4 years? Because Dewey just served 1 term.
But do you want to serve one term?
Yeah,
No.
he ran twice, I believe. And then before that was Kathy Taylor. But your point is
Yeah, and
you
that
had,
in a city like this, one of the reasons Bynum won was because he was the Republican Democrats liked most, right? And during his campaign against Bartlett, no Democrat ran against him. So he got all the Democratic votes and he got a portion of the Republican vote. And so he beat Bynum in that primary. They never had a full election. Well, this term, right, we've got 2 Democrats running, we've got 1 Republican running. And so what I'm saying is that if the far left decides that Karen Keith is not going to be the nominee and they want Monroe Nichols, then you're looking at a prospect in November where you have Van Norman and Nichols, or Van Norman and Karen Keith. My point is that if you go to a general election in November with Van Norman on the ballot, with Donald Trump on the ballot, with Kevin Hern on the ballot, the city is probably going to elect a Republican mayor. That's what it likes to do, unless it has no other choice and has a Democrat who it can stand, or a Republican it can stand. Now, I don't think there are enough Democrats alone who will vote to get the Democrat over the top. I think you need Republican voters. So in November, if there's a Republican if there's a Democrat Republicans can stand, that would be Karen Keith. And you have a Republican who they carries the brand. Who's going to win that race? So the only real way I think that a Democrat wins this, which would be Nichols or Keith, would be if one of them has 50% plus one come tomorrow. That's probably not going to happen. So the question is, who has a better chance in November to win against Van Norman, Nichols, or Keith? My point is, I think you'd have to say Keith has a better chance. That was my point.
so do you vote, and granted, you are friends with Karen. Do you vote based on, see, I look at it a little different. I don't think that I don't think Monroe is pulling from Karen necessarily. I think Van Norman is. And
I agree.
and I've seen, it's kind of interesting. You talk about some of the things you're seeing. I'm seeing a lot of kind of the last minute mailers that are going out. You're seeing that you were bothered by her being portrayed as a MAGA candidate. And the question you had to me yesterday is how much of this is true, correct?
Well, I got three texts over the last 3 days is how much of this is true. They're getting the mailers also. People who would otherwise be inclined to vote for Karen Keith are asking, is this true?
And
And as
so
you
what did you find out? So what were the things, because these last minute sort of campaigns do take a different tone. And I'm seeing mailers for, say, city council that are just outright lies. They've even stolen some of our copyrighted photos and used it. And they dead end into a LLC or a PO box. And so it's almost what troubles me in these last, and it happens every election, is that we have a lot of dark money and they can just outright lie, outright, exaggerate. And yet the penalties are nothing. I mean, the state ethics commission at one point only had 5 investigators for the entire state, and they can't take complaints until after an election. So if you're a campaign advisor with very little ethics or morals, then you just work fees and fines into your cost. And if your person loses, the likelihood is no one's going to do anything because the person's lost. And if they win, we'll just work that fine and fees into the cost and we move on.
Or you shove the whole thing under the umbrella of it. Politics ain't being
right. I mean, dirty tricks and stuff is not new, but I think you're looking at it from a progressive, saying the progressives are tearing each other apart, and that's what bothers you, right?
Yeah, and again,
I think the conservatives do the same thing, though.
Right, but I understand why that would happen, right? I mean, if you're a Nickel supporter, how else do you separate yourself from Karen Keith, right? Now, I think that both.
I think that and like I say, I think in the editorial board kind of said this. We did as a board. This is not Ginnie Graham necessarily talking, but we backed Monroe Nichols, and with the caveat that Karen would be fine. Karen would be great. The only 2 qualified people in this race are the 2 Democrats. They're the only 2 that have had any public experience, any work in government. They've lived they understand Oklahoma. Brent Van Norman has just run, he's only lived here 3 years. He has not worked or volunteered in any sort of Tulsa institution, not even a nonprofit board we can find. He's making it a hyper partisan, and he's been on a stage with Ryan Walters and Jackson Lahmeyer, who is a Christian. He admits he's a Christian nationalist pastor. So those are our choices. And, I don't know. It depends on who comes out, right, to vote. Right. So the last mayoral election, 34% of people voted. So 66% of Tulsans stayed home. And the highest, at least in recent history, the biggest turnout for a mayor's election was between Kathy Taylor and Dewey Bartlett, and that was only 36%. That was the highest there was. So the question is, who brings out more voters? I mean, these are not representative of Tulsa, right? So what's keeping people from voting? Well,
I think, you hit it, that Karen's strength is also her weakness, that she's safe, right? That's what Roger Randall said. She hasn't
really put forth a lot of ideas, though, Barry.
Right. And so the people who want to change candidate don't automatically say that's Karen. Right. They go, that's Monroe, right? Republicans, I think, with Van Norman, have somebody they can vote for. That Christian nationalism thing is worrisome to everybody, it seems, but I wouldn't say but Republicans, but they will excuse it if they can get a Republican candidate who will give them 90% of other things that they want. And I think that's where we are now, that of that 34% that's coming out tomorrow, are you going to have Republicans coming out? Are you going to have progressive Democrats coming out? Are you going to have people coming out who go, you know what? I just would like Karen Keith because I want continuity from G.T. Bynum. And what I want is a mayor who's not going to screw things up. Because right now, Tulsa's got a pretty good vibe nationally, pretty good vibe internally. And so there are people who go, let's just not mess with this too much. And again, I don't blame Karen Keith for running that type of campaign. The Tulsa is in pretty good shape. not specifically about homelessness and a bunch of things, but it's in pretty good shape. And so to run a campaign like, hey, I will continue doing that, was a pretty sound strategy. Now, since there's no polling out there, we have no idea what's really going on, right?
Right. I mean, we're down to gut checks. There is some polling. Um, Karen was slated to win it outright. I believe that's changed over time and it's internal polling. But it brings up the question of what are people looking for? Because I have gone through forums. We held a forum. I mean, there's a really good questionnaire on our website that all the city council and mayor's candidates filled out that asked specifically, how will you do things? What are your opinions on everything from, the beyond apology process to, how are you going to support schools? And Monroe has very specific things. And I think when people look at that has resonated and connected where, some of the other candidates, they're platitudes. It's, we'll communicate and we'll get together and we're going to have, and I kind of wonder what are people wanting to hear out of the mayor's candidates? Do they want to hear something specific? Are they looking for something that comforts them? I mean, that's what I'm sort of wondering. And because I personally like to know specifics. Tell me how you're going to structure your office. Can you give me 3 things you're going to actually do within the first, 90 days? Some people may not. So when you are looking at a candidate, even if it's beyond the mayor, your city council candidate, what are the things you want to hear when we're running up to the election?
Well, and intelligence and articulation. And again, this is too cynical, but when I look at Tulsa, what I would like are representatives who somehow can articulate the fact that we are in Oklahoma, but not of Oklahoma, right? That there's a perception of Tulsa being progressive and being forward-looking and not being just mean-spirited. And I think to that extent, there are Democrats out there who would just like this city to keep progressing, right? That's why we thought G.T. Biden was a pretty good mayor, all things considered, right? We thought he was the guy.
I just wrote a column saying he might be one of the best in history.
If when I interviewed him, I said, you were the Republican we hated the least. I mean, he was the guy. He would still, he would still be mayor. I think he would be the favorite if he decided.
Oh, I would agree. But you know what else he did? He had people around him. He had as many conservatives as progressives around him. He really lived that Abraham Lincoln principle of, a team of rivals.
Team of rivals.
Right. That you want to have this diversity of thought around you that I think he embraced. And that's another thing I'm looking at is someone that we're going to put in office. Are they just going to surround themselves with the same like-minded people? Or are they going to put some people around them that are going to challenge them?
And I think we can pretty well be certain that Van Norman is not going to have Karen Keith in his cabinet, right?
I don't think the way he's running this, I don't think he's going to have anyone that's not a far right Republican, not even like a middle of the road Republican. But
and again, I think for Karen Keith to win, she has to attract Republicans the way G.T. Bynum attracted Democrats. Which might be easier if there weren't another Democrat in the race, but there is. That, to me, is what's going to happen now. Of all the scenarios after tomorrow, they're all plausible. You could have a Monroe-Keith election. You could have, Monroe-Nichols. You could have Keith-Nichols. You could have Keith winning outright. I think the only scenario where anybody would win outright would be Keith. Wouldn't you agree?
At this point, probably. I don't think that's likely at this point.
I don't either.
I think Van Norman has eaten into her support a bit. It's interesting. Do you vote based on who you think is going to win, or do you vote based on who you gut check is the most qualified? And that's always the dilemma, right? Whether you're in a group making an endorsement, whether that's, the chamber or here, wherever, or personally, do you put your vote in where you think someone needs it, or do you put your vote in saying, yeah, but here's who I believe is the most qualified? And that's where you're arguing, put your vote on the person who should win, who is most likely to win.
I think in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that's where I would lean. Though I
See, I
admire.
disagree. I think I'm leaning toward, just because I'm tired of politics
Okay.
of the day, of the era. Because and maybe I'm coming at it from a Gen X, or where I'm like, how many Bushes and Clintons can we have running at all time? Where sometimes I think, we need to look outside that name recognition sometimes. But that's
Well,
just,
I admire you for endorsing Nichols. I think the Tulsa World
again,
said,
this is the board, not Ginnie Graham.
I
But
know, no, I meant
that's
the
where we're
board.
coming from. So I'm hearing
Yeah.
a lot when I'm out. Here's the most disturbing thing to me. People don't even know that there's a mayor's election tomorrow. I went to schedule. Can I just tell you a real quick story? Went to schedule pick up at my kid's school. John Jolly, who's running, was there, and I made some, and he knew a bunch of people, and I made some quip about, hey, the next mayor of Tulsa. Literally, people around us who knew him, are friends with him, said, "You're running for mayor? When's the mayor's election?" And I was like, "Oh my gosh, all this work that we do, and the
Right.
average person doesn't even know your friend is running for mayor."
I think you're right. In my mind, in your mind, I think Keith and Nichols are both and would both be very good mayors, right? There's no problem with either one of them. I think they both would support each other, endorse each other if one or the other doesn't make the runoff. And I think it's interesting that there is this divide now. And everybody has to be a political pundit too. They have to play the game also. They have to game it out, right? That we're in Oklahoma, we're in Tulsa, where even in Tulsa, Trump won by 6-13 over
Well,
Biden.
Tulsa County. We don't know about the city of Tulsa.
Right. And that's nothing. But I mean, this is clearly still a Republican
Mhm.
place, right? And so as a Democrat, and what do we have, like 11 in Oklahoma? We have to figure out a way to make this work. And if your knock against Karen Keith is, well, she's too cozy with Republicans, or she works with Republicans, or hires Republican handlers, well, what else are you going to do in Oklahoma? You have to work with Republicans.
Oh,
If you
absolutely. I mean,
and,
to try to get that center is a very hard thing to get, because I know that some of the progressives are really upset with her recent video of her saying she was going to work with law enforcement to get rid of homelessness and arrest panhandlers. Well, that appeals to conservatives, but progressives are like, whoa, we've done that. That's expensive, and I don't think that's really what she means, but that's certainly the campaign that's put out there at this moment. So, but yeah, I mean, to appeal to the middle, but at a certain point, you have to sort of make decisions where, and this is the problem with the thing with Tulsa Mayor, you have to make decisions that half the city is hating you at any given point.
right.
It's not right or wrong. It's just half the people are going to be mad. And I think you see that in the starts of the campaigns. But I looked up, and actually I didn't look up, Kevin Canfield did, about the city of Tulsa. Because yes, we're a Republican state. Yes, we're a Republican county. And we are a Republican city, but not by much. And there, you could argue either way. Because when you look at the city of Tulsa registrations, 87,000 are Republican,
Okay.
80,000 are Democrats, but 50,000 are independents, and about 2,400 are libertarians. So I don't know where those independents are. Are they left leaning, right leaning? I mean, I'm an independent. I've never had a ballot that's just all one. So there's an argument to be made if this is a pretty purple city, and it really does depend who is motivated to get out and vote, who remembers to get out and vote, because that's a pretty slim margin.
But go out south and count the nickel signs.
Oh,
If
I
you
know.
will.
I live there. There's
And show me where this purple city has manifested itself other than Republicans who tack towards the middle. I mean,
Oh, look
show
at our
me.
state legislature. A lot of the Democrats in the state legislature from Tulsa, Suzanne Schreiber, Swope, Melissa Provenzano, John Waldron. I mean, it's there. It might not be seen in signs, but I think it's there.
All right, correct. But here in Tulsa,
Mhm.
show me again, and I'm thinking about the mayoral race, right? I'm looking about what Democratic candidate, what Democratic official could be mayor in this city over the last 20 years. Give me a name,
Kathy Taylor was,
right? And that was the last one, wasn't it?
right. Susan Savage was.
Okay, but again, we're not, I mean, America in Tulsa is not where it was in 2015,
Right. I
2000.
mean, I get where you're saying that. And the one thing I have appreciated about Tulsa is that they're nonpartisan elections. And so no one can just go to, you have to know something when you go vote. You can't just straight party R or D.
Van Norman went out of his way to let people know it's not a nonpartisan election. He's running
Yeah, exactly. And
right?
that turns me off, honestly. And you know what else turns me off? Signs in the right of ways. I hate that. You got to sign in the right of way. And I can't say I was going to pull over my car and like take them out, but then to be someone videotaping Ginnie Graham pulling up someone's signs.
Do nonpartisan elections really matter? I mean, does anybody, if you don't know
I
the
think it makes people at least know who they're voting for. Because if you don't do any research and you don't know, if you don't know. So there's not going to be a party by the name. So you're going to have to do some investigation to find out who's who. It won't take you long to figure out where Van Norman stands on the far right. But you'd have to do a little bit of looking up. I'm curious, how much, I know you're friends with Karen Keith, but you were also voting in city council. You're also voting on other things. How much like research did you do? Did you look at the mayor's questionnaires? Did you watch a forum? I mean, you're as tied in as anyone. How much did you do looking into things?
Well, it's a really great question, and it's a big world and it's a short day. So, like a lot of people, you pick something, you find something, you hear something, and that pretty much colors you for the rest of the election, right? Van Norman makes that statement about Christian legislators, and then he walks it back, which sounds almost as bad as the original statement. And in my mind, he's done, right? And so you hear about Jamie Fowler, who runs for mayor, doesn't run for mayor, promises he's not going to run again, and then he runs again anyway, and he runs against Carol Bush. And I've had, Carol and I have disagreed on a number of things, but clearly she is that bynum Republican for me. So I hear things, and I'm not that different from a lot of, low information voters who don't follow this as closely as, let's say, you do. But there are things that matter and how people present themselves. And is there anything Van Norman could say to me that would sort of circumvent, that would eclipse that horrendous statement about Christians being the only true voice that government needs? No. So that's how much research I do. Now, there are issues like, in other words, when I hear about Karen Keith maybe being a MAGA Republican or hiring MAGA Republicans to run her campaign, I will look into that issue to find out exactly what's going on. And as you say, I mean, the campaign, who's ever running her campaign, there are a lot of Republicans, there are a lot of MAGA Republicans, but they're in the business to win races. They do seem to win races. And of course, you want to go to somebody who wins. This is politics. This is not beanbag, terrible expression again.
No, but it is. I mean, that did not bother me at all. I mean, you go with and a lot of these a lot of the campaign people, they're going to go where the money is, and she certainly has raised the most money in the race. She's got the most name recognition,
and perhaps the most professional campaign. There's a great story where a bunch of comedians asked Mort Sahl one time, comedian Mort Sahl, how he could possibly have dinner with the Reagans, and this young comedian said to Mort Sahl, nothing could make me break bread with that man. And Mort Sahl said, yeah, like an invitation. In other words, if you have the money to have a professional campaign, you find professionals to run your campaign. Mm-hmm. These guys are amoral, these campaigns.
Right. But, but sometimes what you're saying, there might be a kernel of truth there, but then it's exaggerated out. Right. So she may very well have a position about homelessness that resonates with conservatives over progressives. That doesn't mean she's a right-wing conservative. And I think that's where you're like, let's be reasonable here. Let's,
right. Now, I heard her speak to a bunch of business owners in Brookside about homelessness. They have, whether you're a Republican or Democrat or conservative, MAGA, Christian nationalist, if you own a restaurant and there are homeless people congregating outside your building, you have a different view of homelessness than people who don't experience that on a day-to-day basis. Mm-hmm. And to speak to them about their problem with homelessness and accosting their customers, it may sound more MAGA to you than it should, but those are the realities that I think a mayor, as you say, you're going to piss off 50% of the people when you wake up in the morning. So there are issues out there that you have to take stands on. As soon as you take stands on, you get criticized. If you don't take stands on them, you have people go, "Why don't you take a stand on something?"
Exactly. And that's where I'm at. I'm like, take a stand. Let's know where you're at. So that's where I'm at. Well, we are kind of running out of time. We're trying to keep it succinct. What are the thoughts that are in your mind? People got to go vote tomorrow.
If I had to
else?
predict right now,
Huh?
you want me to predict right now?
Oh, I'm not predicting. If I could predict elections, I would be in a whole different business.
Okay.
It is as someone reminded me, I'm on a board and we still do editorials at Tulsa World for local elections. And it's hard because as Ken Neal and Alex Adwan once said, we have relatives on both sides.
Right.
And so it is hard. I mean, ideally, and that's where I'm going to predict, ideally it should be a Keith Nichols runoff. They're the only two who I think are qualified to represent us.
I agree with you, and I think it's probably going to be a Keith Van Norman runoff. And at that point, we're going to see just how progressive Tulsa is.
Well, then we do another podcast and have a whole different conversation, won't we?
Sounds good.
Barry, it's always great talking to you. We're going to do this again. Everyone, tune in.
Take care.
Take care.